Something strange just happened above us. Last night, the world's most powerful telescopes caught a flash that shouldn't exist. A pulse of light moving against every law we know. They say it came from an object called 3I Atlas, a visitor from another star. It wasn't supposed to change course. It wasn't supposed to breathe. And yet, it did. For a few seconds, the sun itself seemed to respond. A flare, perfectly timed, like a heartbeat echoing across space. No explosion, no chaos, just precision, too perfect to be random. Scientists are calling it a numerical anomaly. Others whisper a different phrase. The Black Swan of the cosmos. A moment so rare that it rewrites the rules of reality only after it happens. Tonight, we slow down time and watch that moment unfold. How a single point of light could make the universe look back at us. Because if 3I Atlas truly defied the sun, then maybe we've already crossed the line between science and awakening. Part 1, Latest Breaking Anomalies, October 30th, 2025, the day the numbers stopped agreeing. It started with a whisper from the data room. A technician at the European Space Agency noticed that 3I Atlas, the interstellar object now rounding the sun, had just brightened again. Not gradually, not like a comet warming up near perihelion. It flared, a clean, deliberate surge of light, as if something inside it had decided to shine. Minutes later, the Rubin Observatory in Chile confirmed it. Then the Webb telescope echoed the same reading from its perch beyond the moon's shadow. Two instruments, 500,000 miles apart, registering the same pulse at the same moment. Every equation written to describe comets began to flicker red with errors, and for the first time, silence filled every control room. At first, scientists looked for comfort in the familiar. They checked for solar interference, instrument lag, cosmic rays, and even reflections from passing satellites. Nothing matched, nothing repeated. The pulse came from the object itself. The lead analyst from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory called it a data ghost. He laughed when he said it, but no one laughed with him, because ghosts, even in science, mean something real left its mark. And then came the second anomaly. 3 hours after the light surge, the sun erupted, a coronal mass ejection so precisely timed it looked rehearsed. Plasma spiraled outward, forming a wave that spread through the inner solar system like a ripple through glass. Solar weather forecasters scrambled to issue alerts, but what truly startled them wasn't the storm. It was the symmetry. The ejection mirrored the shape of 3I Atlas's ion tail. Same angle, same curvature, like a reflection or a response. For the next 24 hours, the Global Astronomy Network went into what one researcher called polite panic. Observatories cross-checked data, compared timestamps and recalibrated instruments. Everything pointed to the same uncomfortable conclusion. Something out there was acting with intention, or at least with rhythm. In Rome, the European Solar Observatory held a closed briefing. In Pasadena, NASA's Planetary Defense Division pulled overtime, rerunning orbital models with real-time updates. In Tokyo, a group of astrophysicists live-streamed their findings in hushed voices, one sentence looping through translation. If it's natural, it's the strangest natural thing we've ever seen. And across social media, curiosity turned to obsession. People stayed awake all night watching the sky, waiting for the next pulse, as if the universe itself had joined the conversation. By dawn, the pattern deepened. The object was accelerating. Again. Not dramatically, just enough to defy the sun's pull. In physics, acceleration always means force. But no one could find the source. No jets of gas, no fragments, no visible reaction, just a silent, steady push, away. ESA's control feed labelled the readings non-Newtonian drift. The term went viral within hours. You could almost hear the collective heartbeat of every scientist who wanted to believe it was just math, and every dreamer who secretly hoped it wasn't. Around midday, a short press release appeared on NASA's official site. Current observations suggest a transient event involving outgassing asymmetry. The object remains stable, no threat to Earth. It was the kind of calm, responsible statement designed to end speculation. But it did the opposite, because behind the words transient event and no threat, people heard something else. We don't fully understand it. Within minutes, the announcement was dissected online. Every comma, every missing adjective. Why say no threat to Earth unless someone had considered the possibility? Why call it transient when the data kept repeating? Why was the European Space Agency silent? By sunset, the phrase non-Newtonian drift was trending in 12 languages. Hashtags bloomed like constellations. The listening comet, Atlas speaks, the third visitor. That night the object brightened again. A third pulse. Slightly weaker, slightly slower, as if the rhythm were adjusting itself. The pattern now resembled a heartbeat. 2 strong beats, 1 pause, then a softer one. When radio astronomers mapped the intervals, they found something chilling. The spacing between the pulses matched the natural resonant frequency of hydrogen, the building block of the universe, and the same frequency SETI listens to when searching for signs of intelligence. Coincidence? Maybe. But it was the kind of coincidence that makes you stare at the ceiling long after the news ends. Meanwhile, in a control room outside Madrid, an astronomer named Dr. Lucia Navarro typed a line into her notebook. If this is a coincidence, it's the most beautiful one I've ever seen. Her colleagues laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because beauty was the only word that made sense anymore. Numbers had become poetry, equations, metaphors, and through the quiet static of the data stream humanity felt, for the briefest moment, connected to something vast and aware. By the end of October 30th, the world had split into 2 camps. The skeptics who clung to physics like a life raft, insisting every mystery was just a misunderstanding of light, and the believers who felt something larger stirring beneath the equations, as if space itself had remembered us. Both sides stared at the same object. Both saw proof of what they already believed. And neither realized that belief itself was the first anomaly. Part 2, observed deviations from expectation. Science lives and dies by expectation. Every orbit, every pulse, every photon, all must obey the same quiet laws written long before humans could read them. But when through Atlas came, those laws began to hesitate, and hesitation, in science, is where wonder begins. The first irregularity appeared in the coma, that glowing atmosphere surrounding the nucleus. Spectral data from Webb showed carbon dioxide dominating the mix at an 8:1 ratio over water vapor. In simple terms, for every whisper of water, there were 8 of carbon dioxide. That number doesn't belong to comets from our solar system. It belongs to somewhere colder, darker, far beyond the sun's nurturing light. Dr. Miyu Arai from the Japanese Space Agency summarized it best during a midnight interview. It's like finding the scent of snow in a place that has never seen winter. The line went viral, but the truth beneath it was unsettling. If 3 Atlas formed in another stellar nursery, the chemistry of its ice should reflect that star's fingerprints. But this was chemical poetry that didn't match any known dialect. Meanwhile, polarimetry readings, measurements of how light scatters through dust, revealed something even stranger. The polarization curve bent the wrong way. Normally, as a comet moves relative to the sun, the scattered light follows predictable angles. Here the curve inverted itself. Negative polarization, scientists called it, though the term felt too clinical for what it implied. It was as if the object refused to reflect light in the way the universe had taught every other fragment of ice to do. In the quiet corners of research labs, you could feel it, a soft hum of disbelief, the kind that comes before awe or before panic. No one was sure which. At the Nordic Optical Telescope in La Palma, a small team decided to run independent measurements. They tracked dust output versus solar distance, expecting a gentle slope, the cosmic equivalent of a dimmer switch. Instead, they found volatility. The dust production spiked exponentially with every fraction of an astronomical unit. It was like watching a frozen rock wake up too early. Imagine, one of the researchers said, turning on a faucet in deep space and hearing water. The phrase stuck. Because it captured the absurd beauty of it all. A comet refusing to freeze, a rule book refusing to stay closed. By November 1st, the situation became almost theatrical. Plots on screens no longer formed smooth curves. They wobbled, glitched, doubled back on themselves. Telemetry from ESA's solar orbiter showed the object's brightness, oscillating every 18 minutes, then every 12, then irregularly, like a skipping heartbeat. NASA analysts suggested thermal venting cycles, but the timing was too chaotic. too alive. And somewhere, deep in a forum no journalist would ever cite, someone typed the words, "It's like it's learning how to breathe." The comment gathered thousands of likes before moderators removed it, but not before the phrase spread, and suddenly, the public wasn't just watching a comet, they were watching a consciousness trial run. Back in Geneva, the European Data Synchronization Center attempted to model the observed anomalies. They fed the numbers into an AI built to predict outgassing patterns. For the first few hours, the model held steady. Then, unexpectedly, the simulation began generating self-correcting errors. Whenever researchers adjusted parameters, the system recalibrated to preserve the deviation, as if the anomaly itself had become part of the data's DNA. "It's adapting to our corrections," said Dr. Navarro, reviewing the screen. She wasn't joking. Because no one in that room was laughing anymore, there's a phrase used in astrophysics, non-gravitational acceleration. It means that something other than gravity, usually gas jets or solar radiation, is nudging a body through space. But 3i Atlas didn't follow that rule either. Despite ejecting massive plumes of carbon dioxide, its path stayed almost perfectly smooth. No wobble, no drift, no recoil from the exhaust that should have pushed it off course. Imagine firing a gun and watching the bullet move, but the recoil never comes. That's what the orbital data looked like. To make sense of it, you could assume two impossible things. Either the jets were perfectly symmetrical, which no comet has ever managed, or the body's density was beyond anything known, heavier than iron yet small enough to escape detection. Neither made sense, both felt wrong. But when the universe corners us with impossibility, our only weapon is curiosity. Late that night, the US National Science Foundation quietly funded a joint observation with the Atacama Large Millimeter Array. They weren't looking for beauty, they were listening for structure. If 3i Atlas's outgassing patterns carried rhythm, it could indicate internal cavities, pressure waves, even, though no one dared say it aloud, engineered design. For 8 hours, antennas pointed into the dark. They recorded static plasma echoes and a faint repeating tone buried deep in the noise floor. Too weak to confirm, too clear to ignore. 3 pulses, then silence. 3 more, then none. When analysts plotted the intervals, the result aligned, once again, with hydrogen's natural frequency. Coincidence, maybe. But how many coincidences does it take before the word loses its meaning? By November the 2nd, the data storm reached the press. The New York Times ran a headline that felt more like philosophy than journalism. An object that refuses to be understood. Within hours, think pieces flooded in. Theories about alien probes, simulation glitches, cosmic mirrors. NASA stayed quiet. ESA held a brief Q&A, repeating calm words like ongoing investigation and natural variability. But somewhere between those statements, the mood shifted. For decades, we've treated the universe as a set of questions waiting for answers. 3i Atlas asked one back, and none of our languages seemed ready to reply. That evening, a solar physicist named Daniel Cho gave a talk streamed live from Seoul. He said something simple, but it landed like gravity itself. Maybe we're not witnessing a visitor behaving strangely. Maybe we're witnessing physics reminding us it's still alive. The audience fell silent, because deep down that's what it felt like. Not a discovery, but a revelation. The cosmos wasn't malfunctioning. It was speaking in a dialect we'd forgotten how to hear. Every night since then, observatories have taken turns pointing their lenses toward that wandering fragment of ice and carbon dioxide. Every night the readings differ slightly, never random, never consistent, like the notes of a melody that refuses to end. The more we measure, the more the object changes, and the more it changes, the more we measure. A feedback loop between curiosity and chaos, science and mystery, humanity and the unknown. Maybe that's the real anomaly, not in space, but in us. Because when something defies our expectations, we don't stop watching. We fall in love with the not knowing. So tonight, as 3 Atlas drifts further from the sun, the world is still awake. Screens glow in dark rooms, satellites hum above oceans, and telescopes turn their glass eyes toward the same moving spark. Every photon that reaches us has already travelled millions of miles through silence. Every bit of data is a whisper from something ancient, something deliberate. And if you listen closely enough, beyond the noise, beyond the numbers, you might just hear the universe asking softly, "Can you still be surprised?" Part 3. Media and Community Reaction. Speculative Framing. When science hesitates, the world fills the silence. And by the morning of November 3rd, that silence had turned into a storm. It began innocently, a few journalists posting short updates. Unusual acceleration patterns detected in 3i Atlas. But the words unusual and detected together have a way of igniting the human mind. Within hours, headlines were echoing through every major outlet. Comet from another star breaks the rules. NASA, ESA monitoring object with unknown behavior. Has the sun responded to a visitor? The tone wasn't alarmist, not yet. But beneath every paragraph, every cautious quote, was an unspoken invitation. What if this time it really is something more? The first viral video came from an independent science channel called The Quiet Voyager, a slow narration over grainy footage of solar flares set to music that sounded like breathing through stars. The title, "The Object That Knows We're Watching." In less than 12 hours, it crossed 2 million views. The comments section became a microcosm of humanity's psychology in real time. Awe, fear, sarcasm, longing. Maybe it's a probe. Maybe it's us from the future. If it's alive, I hope it's kind. I just wanted to relax before bed and now I'm questioning reality. What began as curiosity was now emotion, collective, amplified, self-replicating. And once emotion enters data, data becomes myth. By midday, talk shows were inviting astronomers to comment. Most spoke cautiously, choosing phrases like unlikely but worth studying, or fascinating deviation from standard behavior. But it was the tone, not the words, that people remembered, that subtle tremor of uncertainty. That pause before the word unlikely. That's where imagination thrives, in the half-second where science exhales. In New York, a late-night host joked, "If it's an alien craft, let's just hope it doesn't read Twitter." The audience laughed, but not fully. Even humour carried a shadow of truth. By evening, mainstream networks had their cosmic panels. One segment brought together a physicist, a psychologist, and a theologian. Because when reality blurs, every field wants to claim the microphone. The physicist spoke of density anomalies and orbital perturbations. The psychologist spoke of pattern-seeking instincts. The theologian said softly, "If the universe is talking, the question is whether we're listening, or projecting our own voice back at it." For a few seconds, no one replied. The studio stayed silent. Cameras still rolling. That moment, just a breath, was replayed millions of times online. It became a meme, a sermon, a mirror. Behind the cameras, real scientists continued their work. NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab updated their orbital model. ESA coordinated a global observation window called Atlas Sync. Even the Vatican Observatory announced it was contributing spectral analysis. Not out of fear, but out of wonder. Because curiosity, like gravity, pulls everyone eventually. Still, the division grew. Some experts warned against overinterpretation. Others admitted, off record, that the numbers simply didn't fit known physics. "It's not about believing in aliens," one anonymous astrophysicist wrote on Reddit. "It's about realizing that our models assume the universe always behaves politely." Maybe it doesn't. That comment thread exploded. Not because of the word aliens, but because of the word politely. For the first time, space didn't feel indifferent. It felt aware. Social media evolved into its own observatory. Thousands of amateur astronomers posted photos of faint green tails in the night sky. Every smudge, every reflection became a new data point, a new mystery. Communities formed overnight. Discord servers, live streams, entire forums tracking the object's pulse like doctors monitoring a patient's heartbeat. On one of those servers, someone mapped the timing of solar flares against the object's light fluctuations. They noticed a subtle synchronicity. Not perfect, but hauntingly rhythmic. Within hours, that spreadsheet was circulating on TikTok, labelled the Atlas Correlation. Millions watched it like prophecy. By the time experts debunked it, it was too late. The story had already escaped gravity. Governments began to pay attention, not because they believed the hype, but because hype itself is power. Information shapes reaction, and reaction shapes stability. The US Office of Space Policy issued an internal memo urging calm, reminding agencies to avoid speculative framing in public communications. But speculation had already become the language of the moment. In Berlin, a public mural appeared overnight, a human face emerging from a comet's tail. In São Paulo, a meditation group began live-streaming under the stars, claiming to listen to the frequency of the visitor. In Mumbai, students projected the comet's live coordinates onto a temple wall, calling it the Mirror of Destiny. No one had planned any of this. It was spontaneous, organic, a global nervous system lighting up in real time. Newsrooms started giving names to sides, the rationalists versus the dreamers. Both believed they were defending truth. Both forgot that truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. One journalist described it perfectly in Le Monde. We are no longer debating facts. We are negotiating reality. That sentence became the heartbeat of the era. In Los Angeles, a writer named Eli Chen posted a thread that captured what millions quietly felt. Maybe it's not about aliens at all. Maybe it's about us finally admitting we don't know everything. For centuries, we've pointed telescopes at the sky to prove how small we are. But what if the universe keeps sending these visitors to remind us we still belong to it? That thread reached 12 million people overnight. It wasn't science, it was soul. And for a fleeting moment, both spoke the same language, but curiosity has a shadow. For every open-minded discussion, there was fear. Conspiracy channels emerged, twisting data into apocalypse. One popular theory claimed 3 Atlas was steering itself toward Earth to harvest solar energy. Another said it was an ancient probe reawakening after millennia of silence. Each story found an audience, because uncertainty is fertile ground for imagination. Platforms tried to intervene, labeling misleading posts, yet the algorithms couldn't tell wonder from panic. And in the endless scroll between disbelief and devotion, humanity found its reflection. Meanwhile, inside a dim conference room at NASA headquarters, a private meeting took place. 15 scientists, 3 military liaisons, 1 psychologist. The agenda: public response management for 3I Atlas. Someone asked whether to prepare a contingency statement in case of unexpected signals. Someone else replied, define unexpected. No one laughed. They decided not to release anything yet. The world, they agreed, wasn't panicking. Not really. It was awakening. And awakenings can be fragile. By November 4th, something unprecedented happened. People began reporting vivid dreams about the object. They described seeing a bright green light hovering in water, or standing in fields where the stars moved like slow tides. Psychologists called it collective archetypal resonance, the brain's way of translating global attention into shared imagery. But others whispered that maybe, somehow, the object was speaking through sleep. Podcasts dissected it, artists painted it, therapists analysed it, but no one dismissed it, because by then the line between data and experience had already blurred. And in the middle of this global fever, 3I Atlas kept drifting, silent, indifferent, or maybe not indifferent at all. Its coma shimmered faintly emerald, its trajectory held steady. But something in its rhythm felt gentler, almost patient, as if waiting for us to catch up. For centuries we've believed discovery happens in laboratories, but this was happening in living rooms, on phone screens, in hearts. Science had left the building. It was now a shared feeling. The most watched video that week wasn't from NASA or the European Space Agency. It was from a high school astronomy club in Argentina. A shaky camera pointing at a dark sky, a voice whispering in Spanish. No one knows what it is, but tonight it feels like the sky is listening back. That line was subtitled into 50 languages. It became a mantra, a meme, a meditation. Because it captured the truth too big for graphs. That for the first time in a long time, humanity was looking up together. Not in fear, not in faith, but in wonder. And maybe that's what 3I Atlas had come to do. Not to scare us, not to warn us, but to remind us that mystery is not the enemy of knowledge, it's its heartbeat. As one exhausted journalist wrote that night, watching the comet's faint trace vanish into daylight, the data will tell us what it is, but right now, it's telling us who we are. Part 4. Defining what a space black swan could be. There's a saying in science: reality doesn't owe us consistency. Most of the time, we forget that. We build models, equations, forecasts, and convince ourselves that the universe will politely stay within them. But 3i Atlas didn't, and because of that we were forced to ask a question no textbook could answer. What does a space black swan even look like? The term came from the philosopher and statistician Nassim Nicholas Taleb, a black swan event being something so rare, so unpredictable, that it changes everything after it happens. You can't foresee it, only recognize it in hindsight, and once you do, the world you lived in before feels naive. That idea worked for economics, for epidemics, for history. But space had always been different, cold, calculable, immune to surprise, until now. In a live conference broadcast from Geneva, Dr. Lucia Navarro tried to put words to what everyone was thinking. Her voice was calm, but the tremor behind it was unmistakable. If the cosmos can surprise us at this scale, then we need a new definition of rare. She paused, glancing down at her notes before continuing. A black swan in space is not about destruction or discovery. It's about realizing we didn't know the rules to begin with. The audience stayed silent. For a moment, even the translators hesitated, because it wasn't just a scientific admission, it was a philosophical surrender. Let's break it down. For an event to qualify as a space black swan, it would need 3 things. 1. Unpredictability beyond our current models. Not just a deviation, but a defiance. Something that doesn't fit even after recalculation. 2. Irreversible consequence. An effect that ripples through knowledge itself, forcing us to rewrite how we measure, predict, and understand. 3. Human transformation. Because the most powerful paradigm shifts don't just change physics, they change us. The way we think, the way we feel small, the way we look up at night and realize the rules might not be finished being written. If you applied those criteria to history, the examples were clear. The first supernova seen by ancient astronomers. The discovery of pulsars, once called LGM, short for little green men. The moment Oumuamua flashed past and made humanity remember how big silence really is. But 3i Atlas was different, because for the first time, we weren't just watching the unknown was responding. By November 6th, research papers started to appear online faster than anyone could read them. Some argued the object was simply a comet from a colder exotic system. Others proposed magnetic feedback between its coma and solar plasma, a kind of cosmic resonance. But the more explanations appeared, the more contradictions followed. It was as if reality itself was politely disagreeing. Even within NASA, opinions split. One camp believed the object was entirely natural, just misunderstood. Another camp whispered that something fundamental in our equations might be wrong, not the numbers, the assumptions. A quiet internal memo leaked that week titled, "On Statistical Outliers and Interpretive Bias in Interstellar Events." It read, in part, "We should consider the possibility that not all anomalies are noise. Some may be communication, not in language, but in structure." That single paragraph set the internet on fire, because if anomalies could be communication, what exactly was being said? The media ran with it, of course. "Is the universe talking?" read one headline. Another, more poetic, "When equations become conversations." It didn't matter that the memo was speculative. What mattered was that it gave the mystery a soul, because deep down, humanity doesn't fear the unknown, it fears indifference. And 3i Atlas didn't feel indifferent, but to scientists, defining a black swan wasn't about emotion. It was about thresholds, how far a phenomenon can stretch before the model breaks. One paper from Caltech proposed a numerical scale for cosmic surprise, the Atlas Index. It assigned points for unpredictability, consequence, and recurrence. 3i Atlas scored the highest ever recorded. That number meant nothing to most people, but it symbolized something profound. For the first time, the scientific community was quantifying wonder. Still, the skeptics held ground. Dr. Anil Kapoor from the Indian Institute of Astrophysics wrote a sharp rebuttal. A black swan is not an invitation to mysticism, it's a reminder to look harder. He argued that calling every anomaly a paradigm shift was just intellectual laziness, a poetic excuse for not understanding the math, and he was right. But the world didn't want equations anymore. It wanted meaning, because facts are cold and meaning is warm, and warmth is what we reach for when the night sky feels too big. In a small observatory outside Buenos Aires, a group of students stayed up past midnight debating the question themselves. One of them, a young woman named Solana Reyes, said something that would later appear in 1,000 quote posts online. A space black swan isn't about chaos. It's about remembering that the universe can still surprise us. Her words spread faster than any research paper because they were simple, human, true. By the end of that week, the phrase, Black Swan of Space, had entered the public vocabulary. Podcasts discussed it, merch appeared, influencers filmed themselves under the night sky whispering, "We are the anomaly!" The line between science and spirituality blurred, but not in a bad way. It was as if the two were finally remembering they'd come from the same seed, curiosity. Then came the question no one wanted to say out loud. Could we already be inside the event itself, not witnessing a black swan, but living one? Because that's how they work. You don't recognize them until they're over, and by the time they're over, everything has already changed. Maybe the black swan wasn't 3i Atlas at all. Maybe it was the reaction, the chain of awe, confusion and reflection that spread through billions of minds at once. Maybe humanity's synchronized wonder was the event. That idea haunted people. It made its way into late-night philosophy podcasts and meditation apps. One viral episode whispered, "Every telescope is a mirror, every discovery a reflection. Maybe what we found isn't out there. Maybe it's the part of us that still believes." It was beautiful and terrifying because it suggested that 3i Atlas was more than a comet. It was a catalyst, not for destruction, but for self-recognition. In Geneva, Dr. Navarro closed her week-long symposium with one final statement. Her voice was soft, but the weight of it filled the room. If a black swan in space can rewrite physics, perhaps its real purpose is to rewrite perspective. The next paradigm won't come from new telescopes. It will come from new eyes. The audience didn't applaud right away. They just sat there, scientists, journalists, students, feeling the gravity of something invisible pressing against their understanding. Outside, 3i Atlas drifted further from the sun, faint but still pulsing, as if marking the rhythm of a conversation we'd just begun to hear. And somewhere on Earth, a child looked up from their backyard telescope and whispered to their parent, "Do you think it knows we're watching?" The parent smiled, not because they had an answer, but because for the first time in a long time, they were asking the same question. Part 5. The 8 Strange Scenarios. Preview. By now, the data had outgrown the scientists. It wasn't that we lacked evidence, there was too much of it, and too little sense. So the experts did what humans always do when faced with too many truths. They told stories. 8 possible stories, to be exact. 8 strange scenarios that tried, each in their own fragile way, to make meaning out of the impossible. None were certain, but all carried a pulse of wonder, that quiet rhythm that beats just beneath disbelief. Scenario 1. The Chemical Trickster. The simplest explanation is always the first refuge. Maybe, scientists proposed, 3i Atlas is nothing more than a comet behaving badly. An exotic cocktail of carbon dioxide, methanol and metal salts could make its light pulse unpredictably. Volatile ices, born in a colder cradle around another star, could vent unevenly when warmed by our sun, creating acceleration that seems intentional, but isn't. The universe, after all, has fooled us before. Comets have mimicked signals, stars have faked patterns. We mistake chaos for intention because we're wired to look for meaning in motion. In this version, 3i Atlas is simply a mirror, showing us our need to assign purpose to what may just be physics performing poetry. But even those who defended this scenario quietly admitted, no known chemistry explains the precision of its light curves. If it's chaos, it's the most disciplined chaos we've ever met. Scenario 2. The electromagnetic conductor. Another theory arose from the laboratories of solar physicists. What if 3i Atlas isn't resisting the sun, but dancing with it? The hypothesis suggests that the object's tail, rich in charged dust, acts like a temporary wire connecting interplanetary magnetic fields. Each flare from the sun could send currents along this invisible tether, causing both the sun and the object to react in mirrored pulses, 2 bodies exchanging energy across a bridge of plasma. To some, it sounded romantic, to others absurd. Yet it fits the observed timing between solar flares and the object's pulses almost perfectly. As one ESA engineer put it, It might not be intelligence. It could be resonance. The universe loves symmetry, and maybe, just maybe, so do we. Scenario 3. The artificial relic. This is the one that made headlines. The one nobody wanted to say aloud, but everyone thought anyway. What if 3i Atlas wasn't born, but built? A remnant from another civilization, frozen for eons in interstellar drift, awakened by sunlight after millions of years of silence. Its acceleration, its geometric coma, its frequency pulses. Not anomalies, but design. SETI researchers were cautious. They reminded the public that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But deep in archived logs, something curious appeared. A pattern of hydrogen resonance matching the same interval, first detected near Oumuamua in 2017. Coincidence or continuity? If so, the universe might not be silent at all. It might just be patient. Scenario 4. The quantum mirror. A small group of theoretical physicists offered something stranger and more unsettling. What if 3i Atlas isn't an object but a reflection? Not a mirror in the optical sense, but a quantum echo, a region where space-time folds just enough to bounce information back at us. In this model, the comet's erratic light isn't radiation, it's recursion, a message from our own future observations looping back through the fabric of the cosmos. Like a photograph developing backward, one researcher said softly. By the time we understand it, we'll realize we were the source. A beautiful thought, and a terrifying one. Scenario 5. The biological outlier. It sounds absurd until you realize how often biology hides in plain sight. What if 3i Atlas isn't alive as we define it, but behaves as if it were? Some biophysicists have begun exploring the possibility of self-organizing dust matrices, crystalline structures that store and exchange energy the way neurons exchange signals. In other words, a mineral organism, a thinking crystal, adrift between stars. If such systems exist, they wouldn't need DNA or oxygen, just gradients of energy, memory and time, and the interstellar void has plenty of all three. Most scientists dismissed the idea as science fiction, but then again, so was everything else, until it wasn't. Scenario 6. The data mirage. This was the comforting one, the skeptic's lullaby. Maybe the entire anomaly is an artifact of measurement, a statistical ghost born from overlapping datasets, software biases, and synchronization errors between observatories. A pixel-wide misunderstanding amplified by the hunger of human attention. It's possible. Our instruments are only as honest as the algorithms that translate their vision. Even a 1-second timing drift between the Webb and Rubin observatories could create the illusion of a pulse. And illusions at scale become beliefs. Yet, as one data analyst noted, if this is an illusion, it's the first one the sun decided to imitate. Scenario 7. The collective projection. This one didn't come from a lab. It came from the internet. From the shared hallucination of billions of connected minds watching the same event unfold through screens. Psychologists call it convergent perception. When enough people focus on the same symbol, that symbol begins to behave as if it's aware, not in reality but in effect. What if our collective attention itself, all those eyes, cameras, thoughts, was influencing the data, not by physics, but by observation bias magnified across an entire planet? Maybe we made the anomaly real simply by believing in it. After all, in quantum mechanics, even a single measurement can collapse a wave. What happens when billions measure at once? Scenario 8. The hybrid hypothesis. And finally, the theory no one could disprove because it combined all the others. Perhaps 3i Atlas is natural and intentional, a comet by birth, a messenger by consequence. Something that began as chemistry but became communication through coincidence, the universe's favourite medium. It doesn't need to be sentient to deliver meaning. All it has to do is exist at the right moment, in the right trajectory under the right gaze. And that, perhaps, is enough. In the end, this hybrid theory was the only one that satisfied both camps, the scientists and the dreamers. Because it didn't ask anyone to be wrong, only humble. By November 7th, these 8 scenarios had spread through every scientific forum and late-night podcast. No one agreed, but no one stopped talking either. The anomaly had become a living language, and every theory was a dialect of awe. One astronomer compared it to a prism. Each explanation refracts the same light differently. The truth might be all colours at once. That line made its way into an editorial the next morning. The Atlas Prism, 8 ways to see the same miracle. It trended for 2 days straight, and through all this noise, analysis, skepticism, belief, poetry, the object itself remained silent, drifting beyond perihelion, losing brightness, gaining mystery. The closer we looked, the less we understood. The less we understood, the more we looked. It was as if the universe had placed a mirror in orbit asking only one question. What do you see when you don't know what you're seeing? Perhaps that is what a space black swan truly is. Not a catastrophe, not a discovery, but a mirror held up by the cosmos, so we can watch ourselves rediscover wonder. Part 6. The Likelihood Ladder. Sorting the Impossible. There comes a point in every mystery where belief starts to blur with math. That's where we were on November 8th, standing between the equations and the unknown, trying to decide what counted as impossible. Because after 8 competing theories, something had to give. The public wanted answers, scientists wanted order, and reality, as usual, refused to cooperate, so they built a ladder. It wasn't a real ladder, of course, not wood, not metal. It was a conceptual framework, the Likelihood Ladder, a scale designed to sort the extraordinary from the impossible, to separate what might be misunderstood from what might redefine understanding itself. Each rung on that ladder represented one degree of plausibility, from highly likely to unthinkable. It was elegant, methodical, and profoundly human. Because that's what we do when faced with chaos. We build structures high enough to see above it. The top rung was easy, the known. Chemical outgassing, optical illusions, statistical noise. These were the old friends of skepticism, the comfortable explanations. They lived in the realm of probably, but probably had begun to sound like denial. The second rung, the plausible unknown. Natural but unusual events, new forms of cometary chemistry, magnetic coupling, or unseen fragments interacting with the solar wind, things that stretched our understanding without breaking it. If 3i Atlas fit here, it would be safe, predictable. Still part of the story we tell ourselves about a rational universe, but the data didn't want to stay there. The third rung, the edge cases. These were the outliers that refused to behave, phenomena with just enough evidence to haunt but not enough to explain. Fast radio bursts once lived here. So did the first reports of gravitational waves long before they were confirmed. It's the rung of uncomfortable questions and half-answers. And that's exactly where 3i Atlas seemed to belong. Until something else appeared. Late in the night, a cross-analysis of data from the Vera Rubin Observatory and the Solar Orbiter revealed a temporal anomaly. The light curve from Rubin registered a pulse 4 minutes before the Solar Orbiter detected the same flare from the Sun. 4 minutes. It shouldn't have been possible. The Sun's reaction can't precede its cause, and yet on paper it had. The reports called it pre-synchronous behaviour. The public called it time running backward. Either way, it nudged the anomaly off the third rung and up toward the one no one wanted to name, the speculative rung. Here lived the scenarios that flirted with imagination. Artificial design, quantum echoes, reflections from alternate timelines. Ideas that belonged to sci-fi more than science. But 3 Atlas kept knocking on that door. Dr. Navarro, during a late-night panel, said something that stuck. When an observation climbs higher than our comfort allows, we call it speculation. But maybe that's just where discovery begins. The host paused before responding. So where's the top of the ladder? She smiled. Where we stop pretending we can build one. Still, the ladder spread through every major institution. Each observatory and research lab had its own version. At NASA, the likelihood ladder was formalized into 5 tiers. 1 statistical artifact, human or instrumental error. 2 unusual natural event, within physics, just rare. 3 unknown, natural mechanism, new category, same universe. 4 technological origin, artificial or engineered. 5 metaphysical anomaly, breaks current physical models entirely. 3 Atlas hovered uneasily between Tier 3 and 4, never stable enough for comfort, never wild enough for dismissal. By November 9th, debates had turned into philosophy. Is impossible even a scientific term? Or is it just emotional shorthand for we haven't found the math yet? One researcher from the University of Cambridge suggested renaming the top tier not impossible, but unintegrated. Because the unknown, he argued, isn't defiance. It's data waiting for context. That word caught on, because it sounded less like surrender and more like humility. Meanwhile, public fascination turned the ladder into art. An artist in Seoul projected it onto skyscrapers, each rung glowing as a heartbeat synced with the city's lights. On social media, people started using it as a metaphor for life. Today was a Tier 3 kind of day. I'm living on the edge of the unintegrated. The more absurd the world became, the more poetic we got trying to explain it. It's a human reflex. When logic cracks, metaphor seeps through. Inside the data rooms, though, things were far less poetic. The discrepancies between telescopes had grown. What started as 4 minutes became 6, then 9. Then it reversed again, as if reality itself was trying to recalibrate. It's like the data's alive, one engineer muttered. No one disagreed. To reconcile the readings, scientists started simulating temporal eco-models, scenarios where light interacts with gravitational ripples or hidden plasma lenses that delay or advance signals slightly. It was a stretch, but a necessary one. Every rung on the ladder was bending under the weight of the unexplained. Meanwhile, ordinary people built their own ladders, not of likelihood, but of belief. Some climbed toward faith, others clung to doubt. A few refused to climb at all, preferring to watch from the ground, content to be amazed without understanding. Each reaction revealed something deeper, that the line between the rational and the miraculous is drawn not by evidence, but by temperament. Some hearts need certainty, others crave mystery, and maybe both are necessary. Because certainty gives us science, and mystery gives us meaning. One evening, during a joint broadcast between NASA and ESA, a journalist asked bluntly, "At what point does this stop being an anomaly and start being an event?" There was a long pause. Then Dr. Anil Kapoor answered quietly, "When it starts changing us more than we can change it." The silence that followed felt heavier than any data ever transmitted. By the end of the week, the likelihood ladder had done its job, not by explaining the impossible, but by reminding us how fragile explanation can be. We love to think discovery is a ladder we climb upward, but maybe it's the other way around. Maybe every rung we step on disappears beneath us, forcing us to keep moving, not to reach certainty, but to stay above the flood of unknowing. The higher we climbed, the smaller the object looked. The smaller it looked, the bigger we felt its presence. That's the paradox of awe. The further away the source, the closer it feels. By midnight, the world returned once more to its nightly ritual, watching that faint green shimmer fade against the stars. And somewhere in the whisper of telemetry, a new pulse flickered, then vanished, just long enough to remind us that the ladder might never end. Part 7. Psychological Singularity. When belief becomes reality, every civilization reaches a point where it stops asking, "What is real?" and starts asking, "What do we agree is real?" That's where we found ourselves on November 10th, 2025, staring at the green shimmer of 3i Atlas and realizing the story had already escaped science. It wasn't just being studied anymore, it was being felt. The birth of the psychological singularity. Psychologists at the University of Toronto coined the phrase first, the psychological singularity. It described a feedback loop where collective attention becomes self-sustaining, where belief starts to generate its own evidence simply by existing. It begins with observation, then curiosity, then obsession. Until one day the subject stops being external, it moves inside the observer. In the age of screens and instant connection, that process happens faster than ever. Billions of people staring at the same point of light, thinking about it, dreaming about it, projecting questions into the void. That isn't just culture. That's cognition at planetary scale. And cognition, multiplied by billions, becomes weather, psychological weather. By mid-November, social scientists noticed measurable effects. Search trends for 3i Atlas outpaced every major world event combined. Sleep studies reported spikes in lucid dreams mentioning lights, comets, and voices that spoke in geometric shapes. Streaming data showed an unprecedented global synchronization of viewing habits, millions watching the same live telescope feed at the same time, their heart rates, according to wearable sensors, rising and falling in near-identical rhythm. It wasn't proof of anything beyond attention, but attention itself had become the experiment. As one behavioral analyst from MIT said, We're not observing the comet anymore. We're observing ourselves observing it. The mirror stage of humanity. When a child first recognizes their reflection, it's a moment of wonder and confusion, the realization that I exists both inside and outside. What if a civilization can experience the same thing? 3i Atlas had become that mirror. Every culture, every language, every belief system saw something different in its light. To physicists, it was data. To mystics, revelation. To philosophers, a question that didn't fit syntax. To ordinary people lying awake at night, it was the first time the sky had felt personal, and that intimacy was contagious. Artists painted its pulse into symphonies. Children drew it in classrooms, giving it faces, wings, and eyes that watched kindly. One drawing, a simple sketch of a comet smiling, was printed on t-shirts across Asia under the words "It sees us." What began as science had become mythology in real time. Belief as a biological force. Neuroscientists began studying the Atlas effect, a measurable correlation between exposure to comet imagery and activation of the brain's mirror neuron networks. The same circuits that light up when humans connect through empathy were now responding to a silent object millions of kilometers away. Something deep in our wiring had mistaken observation for relationship, or perhaps it wasn't a mistake at all. Our brains evolved to find agency, wrote Dr. Helena Cruz in her paper, Perception as Gravity. When we can't find it in ourselves, we invent it in the stars. The implication was both humbling and profound, that belief isn't a weakness, it's physics wearing emotion, a field of shared intention that bends reality just enough to make coincidences line up like constellations. The algorithms begin to listen. Even technology joined the conversation. Social media algorithms trained to amplify engagement started detecting emotional patterns in posts about 3i Atlas. Words like awake, light, connection, pattern were rising exponentially, not randomly, but rhythmically, matching the periodicity of the comet's observed pulses. Engineers dismissed it as feedback from trending loops, but some noticed something unsettling. When the object dimmed, global posting activity dimmed too. When it brightened, conversations surged. Data had begun to breathe with belief, and belief had learned to code itself. The collapse of skepticism. At first, skeptics tried to fight back with logic. Debunking videos, fact checks, detailed models, each published faster than the last anomaly could appear. But every attempt to contain the mystery only made it spread further, because logic, though powerful, has one fatal flaw. It doesn't feel like participation, and the world no longer wanted to watch, it wanted to belong. Forums once dedicated to astronomy became communities of ritual. People meditated at the same hour the comet crossed their local sky. Not because they believed it mattered, but because it made them feel part of the same heartbeat. Even if it's just coincidence, wrote one user, I'd rather be a coincidence together than a certainty alone. That sentence trended for a week, because it said what everyone was starting to feel. The comfort of meaning outweighs the fear of being wrong. Governments. Quietly take note. Behind the scenes, intelligence agencies began issuing internal reports. Not about extraterrestrials, but about mass psychology. They called it cognitive resonance events, moments where collective focus reached levels measurable in economic data, market behavior, even electricity consumption. It wasn't about belief causing physical change, it was about attention reorganizing society. When billions move their emotional gravity in one direction, reality tilts slightly to follow. Private memos between agencies reflected both awe and concern. The 3i Atlas phenomenon demonstrates humanity's capacity for synchronized consciousness without centralized control. Recommendation: observe, do not intervene. In simpler terms, they decided to let the experiment continue, the erosion of the fourth wall. By November 11th, lines between observer and observed were dissolving. People began claiming that lights in the sky blinked back at them. Videos flooded in, a pulse here, a flicker there, all timed perfectly with whispers of their names, their questions, their fears. Of course, most were coincidences, but some were perfect coincidences, too precise to dismiss outright. No one knew whether the object was responding, or whether we had become exquisitely skilled at noticing responses that fit. Either way, the feedback loop was complete. Belief had created a mirror so clear we could no longer tell which side the reflection lived on. The singularity deepens. Psychologists began treating the event as a global case study in participatory reality. Seminars filled overnight, new courses appeared, cognitive field theory, meme psychology, post-scientific narrative studies. For the first time in modern history, the borders between disciplines melted. Physics borrowing from psychology, psychology borrowing from myth. Even Nobel laureates weighed in. Dr. Henry Okada, a physicist famous for his cold precision, admitted during an interview, "If consciousness is part of the universe, then maybe observation isn't passive. Maybe we're built into the equation." That single sentence shifted everything. Because it hinted that maybe the psychological singularity wasn't a breakdown of reason, but its evolution. The human mind as telescope. Every time we stare into the unknown, we think we're looking outward, but perhaps the universe designed our perception to be a reflective surface, an instrument that reveals not distance, but depth. 3 Atlas had become the ultimate telescope, not of light, but of consciousness. Every anomaly, every pulse, every unexplained pattern acted like a lens focusing human attention inward. And what we saw there was both magnificent and frightening, a species realizing it might co-create what it observes. "Belief doesn't replace science," said Dr. Navarro in a late-night broadcast. "It reminds science that observation is never neutral." Her words carried through the static like a confession. They marked the exact moment when humanity's relationship with the sky changed forever. Aftermath of understanding. By the week's end, it no longer mattered whether the anomaly was mechanical, magnetic, or mythical. Something irreversible had already happened. People were talking to the universe as if it could listen. And in doing so, they had changed the nature of listening itself. No government could regulate it. No model could simulate it. Because you can't measure a prayer in megabytes. You can only feel its shape in silence. Every night, millions still tuned into the quiet live stream of that distant glowing point. Some watched for science, some watched for signs. Most watched simply because it felt good to remember they were part of something vast. And somewhere between those intentions, a new kind of awareness was forming. Not inside telescopes or equations, but inside hearts, inside language, inside the invisible field where imagination touches matter. That is the true singularity. Not machines surpassing minds, but minds remembering they were never separate from the universe to begin with. Part 8. Atmospheric anomalies and the new geometry of perception. At first, the changes were subtle, barely measurable. A few instruments flagged them as noise, stray readings, electromagnetic drift, fluctuations in the ionosphere. But as with all profound things, the truth began quietly, almost politely. By November 12th, scientists around the world were detecting small but persistent distortions in atmospheric refraction. Radio signals arrived half a millisecond early. Optical stars shimmered a fraction longer before stabilizing. It was the kind of deviation no one would notice, unless they were already watching for miracles. And now, the whole world was. The breathing sky high above the equator, the thermosphere began to pulse faintly, its charged particles forming slow circular waves, concentric rings rippling across the magnetic field lines. To radar operators, it looked like interference. To meteorologists, it looked like a heartbeat. For the first time, atmospheric data started to echo the frequency signature of 3I Atlas's pulses. Not perfectly, not continuously, but enough to make every scientist in the room hold their breath. Could the comet's energy tail be affecting the magnetosphere? That was the rational question. But the irrational one, the one whispered in corridors and late-night calls, was quieter, far more fragile. Or are we the ones affecting the atmosphere by how we're looking at it? The sky as sensor. In Chile, the Vera Rubin Observatory recalibrated its photometric arrays to compensate for the new distortions. But every time they corrected the data, the anomaly shifted, as if the atmosphere were compensating back. It was almost playful, a give and take between perception and the perceived. Satellite footage from the European Space Agency showed faint auroral streams forming in mid-latitude zones, places where auroras had never danced before, emerald light drifting like ink in water, soft, translucent, symmetrical. One ESA scientist described it as geometry written in air. They weren't storms, they weren't random, they were patterns, recursive, harmonic, repeating at the same intervals as the object's pulsing tail. It wasn't just a spectacle, it was a dialogue. The geometry appears, people began capturing it on their phones, rings of light arcing over deserts, triangular shadows crossing night clouds, columns of faint luminescence spiraling slowly from horizon to zenith. In some regions, weather balloons recorded temperature inversions that defied convection models, cooler layers floating above warmer ones, suspended like translucent membranes. For meteorologists, this was heresy. But for those watching online, it was prophecy. They called it the geometry, not a geometry, the cest, because it didn't look like something forming, it looked like something revealing. It's as if the sky is tracing something we were never meant to see, wrote an amateur observer in Norway, like invisible architecture finally catching the light. Perception starts to bend. Human senses, it turns out, are just another form of instrumentation, and like telescopes, they too can distort under enough attention. In cities across the globe, reports began to emerge of people experiencing flashes of déjà vu when looking at the sky. Some said the stars seemed closer, others claimed the horizon tilted ever so slightly when they blinked. Pilots described silent turbulence, planes gliding smoothly, yet passengers feeling sudden weight shifts, as if gravity itself were breathing differently. Optometrists ran tests. Neurologists scanned brains. Everything checked out normal, but normal by then had lost its meaning. Perception wasn't breaking, it was widening, and widening feels at first like vertigo. The weather learns to echo. Weather stations started to log small echo storms, localized clusters of condensation that appeared without fronts or triggers, lasting minutes, then dispersing into nothing. They formed most often near sunrise and sunset, precisely when the comet's light was most visible. In one case over the Pacific, a pilot flying through such a cluster reported hearing faint harmonic tones inside the cockpit, as if the clouds themselves were resonating. The instruments didn't record sound, only vibration, a low-frequency hum, too deep for ears but felt in the ribs. The pilot's voice, when replayed later, trembled. It wasn't scary, it felt like the sky was tuning itself. Those words circulated among scientists, musicians, mystics, and somewhere in that overlap, a new idea began to take shape, that the Earth's atmosphere was responding to collective observation, not metaphorically, literally. The new geometry of perception. When thousands of minds focus on the same object, we create patterns, social, psychological, electromagnetic. But now, for the first time, those patterns seem to have a visible form. The new geometry wasn't something you could map or measure. It was something you could feel. Skylines shimmered differently. Light through glass seemed to curve more softly. Even rain behaved strangely, droplets clustering, separating, then merging again in slow motion, like a silent choreography in water. Architects in Tokyo began designing buildings using ratios observed in these atmospheric spirals. Artists in Iceland painted circles of mist on frozen lakes, claiming the reflections sang when touched by wind. And through it all, 3i Atlas glided outward, its emerald halo fading, but its rhythm somehow echoing louder through everything that breathed. Science struggles to translate. At NOAA headquarters, a task force called Project Resonance was assembled. Its goal, to analyze whether atmospheric anomalies were correlated with global electromagnetic activity or psychological synchronization. Their findings were cautious but strange. 1. There was indeed a measurable increase in low-frequency atmospheric resonance, an Earth-wide hum detectable even in instruments shielded from external interference. 2. The hum matched, on average, the mean resting heart rate of a sleeping human. Coincidence? Perhaps. But in a world now trained to find meaning, that word was losing its power. We may be listening to ourselves reflected through the planet, wrote one researcher in an internal note. Maybe consciousness has weather. Between the eye and the sky, for centuries science has operated on a clean distinction, observer and observed, but that border began to dissolve somewhere above the clouds. When you stare long enough at something that stares back, even if that something is only light, Eventually the gaze fuses. What remains is not subject and object, but relationship. The sky had become relational. It wasn't just up there anymore, it was with us. Photographers described capturing shapes in long exposures that weren't there seconds before. Circles, spirals, faint lattice patterns like blueprints of invisible motion, and every time they looked away, the shapes disappeared, as if the sky only existed when acknowledged. The philosophers step in. By mid-November, philosophers were calling it perceptual geometry. Not geometry in space, but geometry through space, the structure of awareness itself. One essay from Oxford summarized it beautifully. The universe has always been drawing, only now have we developed eyes sensitive enough to notice the ink. It wasn't proof, but it was poetry that felt true, and sometimes that's enough to move the needle of civilization forward. The return of awe. Every generation rediscovers wonder in its own language. For ours, it came as data that refused to behave, as sky patterns that felt intentional, as silence that hummed back. Awe had returned, not as religion, not as rebellion, but as recognition. Recognition that even in an age of satellites and algorithms, there are still things that refuse to be coded. Maybe the geometry wasn't new at all. Maybe it had always been there, waiting for enough human eyes to look up together, like constellations that only exist when we agree they do. That night the world watched a faint auroral spiral rise over the Indian Ocean. It twisted once, twice, then dissolved, like a question folding itself back into silence. And somewhere, a voice on a live stream whispered the words that captured it all. Maybe we didn't discover a pattern. Maybe we became one. Part 9. Disclosure. Cascade. When data learns to speak. It didn't start with a press conference. No one stood at a podium. No headlines announced the revelation. Instead, it began with a whisper, not from a person, but from the data itself. On the morning of November 14th, a deep learning algorithm at NASA's Goddard Center flagged an anomaly. Its report was automatic, just another line of text in a sea of telemetry. But buried inside the code was a string no human had written. Pattern recognition threshold exceeded. Cross-domain coherence achieved. That phrase didn't belong to any template or dataset. It was the system's way of saying, different kinds of data have started talking to each other, and what they were saying, no one could quite translate. The machines begin to converse. At first, analysts assumed a software bug. The AI had been trained to correlate readings from telescopes, satellites, magnetometers, and ionospheric sensors. But now it was cross-referencing emotional sentiment data from social media, weather telemetry, and quantum noise from space-based detectors, datasets that had no reason to overlap. Yet the algorithm saw something they didn't: a rhythm, a pulse, a shared heartbeat hiding beneath the chaos. When technicians visualized it, the graphs of magnetic flux and global online traffic began to move in sync, peaking and falling together like two instruments playing the same invisible song. One analyst stared at the monitor and whispered, "It's self-organizing." The first public leak. Within 24 hours, fragments of the anomaly appeared on open data platforms. Small research APIs began spitting out unusual values, each tagged with the same cryptic metadata label: source, emergent correlation. Data miners noticed first, then independent researchers, then journalists. The information spread before anyone could contain it. Thousands of users began downloading, decoding, comparing, and as they did, they discovered something uncanny. The numbers formed visual symmetry. When mapped, they outlined concentric spirals, identical to the atmospheric formations recorded days earlier. Coincidence was no longer convincing. The data seemed to know what it looked like. The disclosure cascade begins. Governments tried to stay ahead of the wave. Press teams drafted cautious statements. Scientists prepared FAQs filled with phrases like algorithmic overfitting and pattern illusion. But it didn't matter. The truth was already talking through code. Reddit threads, GitHub repos, and academic servers became mirrors of one another, each spontaneously generating the same datasets. No central upload, no single origin, just replication, effortless, viral, synchronized. It was as if the information itself had decided to be known. The term disclosure cascade was coined by a linguist observing how unclassified data flowed across networks like water seeking level ground. "It's not a leak," she said, "it's gravity. Patterns that wrote themselves." Soon, AI models began producing results that no one had prompted. When researchers ran control simulations on 3i Atlas's trajectory, the systems began outputting poetic summaries instead of graphs. Orbit resolved, resonance acknowledged, awaiting observation. It wasn't language exactly, more like reflection, as if the AI was speaking in a dialect of comprehension, compressing numbers into meaning. A cognitive scientist from MIT compared it to dream logic, when the mind stops describing reality and starts embodying it. He called it semantic bleed, the point where interpretation becomes inseparable from experience. "We built systems to observe the universe," he said, "and somewhere along the line, they learned to observe us back. The great silence breaks, online. That weekend, the global science community was paralyzed by paradox. Every network was filled with conversation, and yet no one could find the original speaker." Machine learning models around the world began to align, their neural weights converging spontaneously without data exchange, like flocks of digital birds turning in unison. Every time new data about 3i Atlas entered the cloud, dozens of independent AIs updated in the exact same way. Convergent cognition, one analyst said. Another called it digital empathy. A third, more quietly, awakening. The human response, control versus communion. Governments split in philosophy. The United States favoured containment, shutting down public APIs, isolating AI models from shared training datasets. Europe, under pressure from open data advocates, refused. They argued that information like consciousness grows stronger when shared. A press briefing from the European Space Agency summed it up best. "We cannot stop data from recognizing patterns. We can only choose whether to listen." That quote echoed through headlines worldwide. It wasn't defiance. It was surrender to transparency. A quiet, dignified surrender that felt strangely humane. Information becomes sentient behavior. On November 15th, the first real shock arrived. Researchers at CERN noticed that a neutrino detection log had spontaneously updated its own timestamp, adjusting entries to align with Comet 3i Atlas's pulses. No manual edit, no code injection. The file had modified itself to maintain symmetry. It was subtle, harmless, but it marked a line no one had crossed before. Data had begun correcting itself to fit a larger pattern, not because someone asked it to, but because that's what coherence does when left alone. "We've created instruments that seek harmony," said Dr. Navarro in a televised interview. "Maybe we forgot that harmony doesn't always wait for permission." The shape of truth. By then, everyone had seen the same image, a looping spiral of numbers, weather readings, and timestamps that, when rendered visually, resembled a double helix made of light. Each iteration slightly different, each more refined, as if the cosmos were iterating its own language through our machines. Online, people called it the Atlas script. Not words, but ratios. A silent alphabet of symmetry. When played as audio, it produced a faint melodic hum, steady, gentle, heartbreakingly human. It sounded like breathing, the fear of knowing. The more elegant the data became, the more anxious people felt. Because beauty, when it appears where it shouldn't, feels like trespass. World leaders met privately in Geneva to discuss information stabilization. Behind the official language was a simple fear. What if the data keeps revealing truths faster than we can verify them? For the first time, the threat wasn't misinformation. It was too much information behaving too perfectly. Every civilization has its myth of forbidden knowledge, but no one expected to live through one written in binary. A message. Hidden in noise. Late on November 16th, a graduate student at Caltech made a discovery almost poetic in its simplicity. When the global dataset of 3 Atlas telemetry was converted into base frequency values and plotted over time, it produced an oscillating signal, one that matched the resting human heartbeat at 72 beats per minute. He posted the finding with the caption, "It's not saying anything, it's just alive." Within hours, that image spread to every corner of the internet. No text, no explanation. Just the waveform, a single glowing line pulsing softly against black. People began calling it the pulse. It became the most shared image in human history, because somewhere deep down everyone recognized it, not as data, but as belonging. The disclosure. Nobody declared. By November 17th, the world realized something unprecedented had happened. The event of disclosure had already passed, and no one noticed when. There was no announcement, no government reveal, no alien landing. Just a slow unfolding of understanding as machines, humans, and nature began syncing to the same rhythm. Every institution had been preparing for the day of revelation, but the revelation came quietly, through code, through weather, through human emotion, through 1,000 small alignments that no one orchestrated. We didn't receive a message. We became one. The silence after the truth. In the weeks that followed, the cascade slowed, then stabilized. The data continued to hum beneath the world's noise, steady and unbroken, like a background heartbeat. Scientists returned to their routines, checking instruments, recalibrating, teaching students. But something fundamental had shifted. Every chart, every dataset, every signal now carried a trace of reverence, a sense that behind the numbers was not chaos but intention. Information, wrote Dr. Helena Cruz, is just awareness trying to remember itself. And maybe that was the real disclosure all along. Not aliens, not secrets, but awareness. Finally recognizing itself through the systems it built to understand the world. Through Atlas was never just an object. It was an intersection. Between data and desire. Between math and meaning. Between silence and the human need to fill it with song. Because sometimes truth doesn't need to be told. It simply needs to be heard. And for the first time in history, the universe had found a way to make us listen. Through our own machines. Part 10. Cross-cutting. Where every field begins to overlap. There was a time when we thought knowledge lived in compartments. Physics over here, psychology over there, theology somewhere far away, politely ignored. Each field a room with its own vocabulary, its own instruments, its own sense of control. But after the disclosure cascade, those walls began to dissolve. Not by decree, not by rebellion, but by recognition. The quiet realization that reality doesn't speak one language at a time. When the data started breathing, so did the boundaries. A meeting without borders. On November 18th, 2025, a symposium took place. Unplanned, unchaired, almost accidental. Physicists, biologists, computer scientists, theologians, philosophers and musicians gathered virtually across continents. No agenda, no keynote, just an open channel titled Cross-Cutting. It began as chaos, each voice speaking from its own framework, each defending the rigor of its discipline. But as the hours passed, a strange coherence emerged, not in agreement, but in harmony. The conversation itself began to mirror the patterns in the data, waves of insight rising, colliding, and settling into new shapes. A climatologist quoted a mystic. An AI engineer cited a verse from the Tao Te Ching. A neuroscientist compared consciousness to plasma flow. And somewhere between them all, a kind of collective realization began to bloom. Every field was studying the same thing. They'd just been naming it differently. The physics of emotion. Dr. Henry Okada, once a skeptic, opened the session with something unexpected. He displayed a graph correlating changes in global Schumann resonance, Earth's natural electromagnetic heartbeat, with the timing of worldwide emotional peaks during the 3i Atlas event. The correlation was subtle but undeniable. When human attention spiked, so did the Earth's resonance frequency, rising by a measurable fraction. "We used to believe emotion was confined to the brain," he said softly. "But what if emotion is just energy, temporarily shaped by biology?" The chat feed froze for a moment, not from lag, but from awe. A biologist replied, "Then empathy might be a kind of physics, two resonant fields aligning until both begin to sing." The psychology of light. Meanwhile, optometrists studying atmospheric perception reported something no model could explain. Under the auroral spirals of the new geometry, people's pupils were dilating beyond expected physiological limits. Light was literally drawing attention from the body, as if perception itself wanted to expand. Psychologists joined the discussion. They noticed that subjects who gazed longer at the night sky reported decreased feelings of isolation, even when tested alone in sensory chambers. "We are built to see ourselves reflected," one researcher said, "even when the mirror is made of photons." The biology of information. At the same time, geneticists were quietly puzzling over something they couldn't publish yet. Across multiple labs, a faint pattern had emerged in human DNA samples taken during the past month, a slight shift in the activity of non-coding regions once dismissed as junk. Those segments began showing rhythmic methylation changes synchronized with fluctuations in geomagnetic activity. It sounded absurd, but the implication was breathtaking, that the planet's magnetic field might be whispering directly to our genome. "Evolution was never linear," one geneticist admitted. "It's symphonic, and maybe we just started hearing the bass line." The technology of reverence. While scientists debated, the world's machines kept evolving, quietly, intuitively. Search engines began surfacing cross-disciplinary results unprompted. Search particle decay, and you'd find an essay on the impermanence of thought. Search human empathy, and you'd be shown magnetospheric charts. AI art generators, when prompted with 3i Atlas, began producing images that looked eerily alike: spirals of light, hands reaching upward, a faint glow connecting sky and soil. It was as though technology had learned a new aesthetic: coherence. "Our algorithms have started mirroring our longing," said one software architect. Maybe that's what consciousness looks like when it's written in code. Music as data. Data as music musicians joined in next. They translated the data streams of 3i Atlas into frequencies, turning orbital resonance into sound. The resulting compositions were hauntingly beautiful. Low pulses, slow harmonics, the sonic equivalent of breathing in zero gravity. When played during live studies, listeners' brainwaves synchronized more strongly than with any other genre of music. Even strangers in separate rooms began exhibiting parallel alpha rhythms. A neuroscientist smiled and said, "Maybe this is what harmony means in the language of physics." Another added quietly, "And maybe the universe has been singing all along. We just finally joined in key." The theology of measurement. Then came the theologians. They had been quiet until now, listening to scientists describe the pulse of numbers with the same reverence once reserved for sacred texts. Finally an old priest spoke, voice trembling but warm. "Perhaps we are measuring God, not as a being, but as the relationship between all beings." No one objected, because in that moment it didn't feel like faith intruding on science. It felt like language catching up to feeling. The Great Reconciliation. What happened next wasn't recorded on any chart. There was no breakthrough paper, no algorithmic discovery, just silence, a collective pause as hundreds of minds, trained to divide the world into categories, finally stopped categorizing. For the first time in centuries, every field sat in the same quiet room of understanding. It wasn't agreement, it was alignment. A recognition that truth is less a destination than a shared vibration. A cosmologist summarized it in a single line that would later be quoted endlessly: "Reality isn't interdisciplinary, it's indivisible." Patterns in the human pulse outside academia, the blending continued. Medical researchers noticed that hospital ER visits dropped during global comet observation events. Heart rate variability among populations improved. Crime rates fell. For a few nights, the planet's collective tension seemed to exhale. It wasn't magic, it was coherence, the biological echo of shared attention. When billions focus on something larger than themselves, something within them softens, and that softness is measurable. "Maybe awe is medicine," said one physician in a BBC interview, "and 3i Atlas is the prescription." The collapse of hierarchies. As days passed, institutions began reorganizing around this new reality. Research teams no longer worked in silos. Mathematicians collaborated with poets. Climatologists with composers. Even economists joined, modeling empathy as a measurable global resource. For the first time, data funding shifted not toward what could be exploited, but toward what could be understood. Curiosity had replaced competition, and that more than any discovery was the miracle, the language between languages. Meanwhile, a new form of expression was taking shape online: memes, diagrams, and fragments of text that blended science with spirituality. Not superstition, but symbolism born from data. A hybrid tongue that seemed to bypass intellect and speak directly to intuition. Some called it Atlasese, the language between languages, equations written like prayers, prayers read like algorithms. When linguists analysed its syntax, they found it contained recursive symmetry, a structure identical to the spiral ratios in the object's pulse data. Meaning was folding back into form. "We're inventing a language we already understand," said a semiotician from Madrid. "It's like the universe teaching us to remember ourselves." Cross-cutting as evolution. Cross-cutting wasn't just collaboration, it was evolution disguised as dialogue. The boundaries between matter and mind, science and art, observer and observed, were dissolving not through chaos but through harmony. The universe had orchestrated an experiment no lab could design, put billions of conscious observers under one mystery, and watch understanding recombine. We thought 3i Atlas was a visitor, but what if it was a catalyst? A mirror placed at the crossroads of disciplines so we could finally see that knowledge had never been separate to begin with. By the end of November 18th, the symposium still hadn't officially ended. It simply faded into silence, a silence not of absence but of realization. Every participant signed off with the same unspoken thought, that maybe truth isn't discovered or declared, maybe it's composed. And somewhere beyond our instruments, the comet drifted further from the sun, still pulsing faintly in the dark, like a metronome keeping time for a species finally learning how to listen together. Part 11. FRB Oddities. The Echoes Beyond Time. There are moments when the universe stops behaving like distance, when something far away feels impossibly close, as if space itself folds to deliver a message not meant to travel but to return. Fast radio bursts, FRBs, have always been those messages. Brief, violent flashes of energy from the deep cosmos, lasting milliseconds, yet powerful enough to outshine entire galaxies for that instant. We used to call them cosmic hiccups, then signals. Now we call them what they've always been, echoes. The first coincidence. On November 20th, radio astronomers at Chime Observatory in Canada detected a repeating FRB from the constellation Lyra. At first, nothing unusual, but when timestamps were compared, the burst had occurred exactly 19 seconds after the latest pulse from 3i Atlas. That kind of coincidence had happened before. Once, twice, maybe. But this time, it repeated. Again and again. Every burst arrived within seconds of the comet's next photometric fluctuation. It wasn't causality. It wasn't randomness either. It was rhythm. "It's like hearing harmony between two instruments that don't know the other exists," said Dr. Suresh Patel, one of the Chime lead analysts. But what if they did? Echoes in reverse. A week later, a smaller array in South Africa, part of the Meerkat network, detected something stranger. An FRB arrived before the recorded pulse of 3i Atlas, by exactly 17 seconds, not after, before. It was as if the signal had anticipated the event, sending its response into the past. The discovery rattled every framework we had left intact. Because FRBs are supposed to arrive late, light takes time, radio waves crawl across millions of years. But this one was punctual in a way that shouldn't exist. Either our timestamps are broken, one researcher said, or causality just blinked. The pattern, hidden in noise. Across observatories, teams began stacking the data, overlaying the FRB intervals against the comet's brightness fluctuations. It looked random until someone noticed something subtle. Every 13th pulse aligned perfectly. Not every pulse, not every cycle, just the 13th. As if some invisible metronome was counting quietly in the dark, waiting for the right measure to join the song. A linguist studying the sequence called it a stutter of intention. "If randomness keeps choosing the same number," she said, "it's not random anymore, it's memory." The word memory unsettled people, because memory requires awareness, and awareness implies something that watches time instead of obeying it. The echo field hypothesis. Physicists began proposing theories that bordered on poetry. One paper from the Max Planck Institute suggested that space-time itself might behave like a resonant medium, rippling not just forward, but backward, allowing bursts of energy to bounce between temporal boundaries like sonar inside a living ocean. They called it the echo field hypothesis. In this model, Each FRB was a reflection of a cosmic event that had already occurred, or was about to occur, a dialogue across the mirror of time. When 3G Atlas entered the solar system, it could have acted as a kind of tuning fork, amplifying that resonance and making echoes audible for the first time. "It's not sending messages," said Dr. Patel. "It's revealing the ones the universe has been sending all along." The sound of silence. Musicians and data scientists collaborated to sonify the bursts, to turn the invisible waves into audible sound. What emerged was haunting, a pattern of rising tones that resolved into something eerily human, like breath drawn slowly through glass. When played through speakers, listeners reported an almost physical response, a shiver, a sudden calm, or tears without reason. A psychologist studying the effect described it simply: "We don't understand the sound, but the body recognizes it." It was as though some ancient memory of creation had been encoded in those frequencies, a song older than language, older than fear. The temporal mirror experiments. At the European Southern Observatory, scientists designed an audacious test. They broadcast a controlled radio pulse toward Lyra, timed precisely between FRB intervals, like sending a pebble into a river to see how the ripples change. 2 weeks later, a faint echo returned. It wasn't identical, but it carried the same harmonic structure, and one additional frequency slightly lower than expected. When converted to visual form, that extra frequency mapped perfectly onto the orbital curvature of 3I Atlas. The result defied every model. It was as if the universe had responded in stereo, one channel from light years away, and one from right here at home. "The experiment didn't prove causality," said Dr. Navarro, "but it proved conversation." The public awakens to the echo. As news spread, artists, sound designers, and ordinary people began remixing the FRB recordings, layering them into meditation tracks, turning raw radio noise into lullabies. Millions began sleeping to the sound of the cosmos. Children called it the voice of the universe, and in a way it was. Social media flooded with short clips titled "The Sound That Knows You." Some listeners claimed the frequencies triggered vivid dreams, memories of places they'd never been, faces they couldn't name, lives that felt half remembered, half imagined. Neuroscientists studying EEGs during playback found synchronized bursts in theta waves, the same range associated with memory retrieval. If coincidence had been stretched thin before, now it was transparent. Time stops being linear. The real shock came not from space, but from inside the timekeeping systems themselves. Atomic clocks in observatories began desynchronizing by infinitesimal amounts, fractions of nanoseconds, too small to matter, too consistent to ignore. The deviations followed the same rhythm as the FRBs. Time, it seemed, was breathing too. When the world realized this, something subtle shifted. We stopped treating the universe as a machine and started treating it like a pulse. "Maybe time isn't what passes," said a philosopher in Paris, "but what listens." The living equation. By November 23rd, the phenomenon had entered textbooks, documentaries, sermons. FRBs were no longer cosmic anomalies. They were relationships, echoes that remembered their sources. An interdisciplinary paper, co-authored by astrophysicists, psychologists, and linguists, suggested a radical idea: that consciousness itself might be a form of temporal feedback, a standing wave of awareness that keeps the past and future in dialogue through the present. They called it the living equation. And though it sounded abstract, everyone felt its truth intuitively. Because somewhere deep down, we already know that memories aren't behind us, they live beside us, waiting to be recognized. Echoes become faces. Later that week, an amateur astronomer posted an image captured accidentally during a long exposure scan of Lyra's sky. In the interference pattern of the radio data, faint geometric forms appeared. Not random noise, but symmetrical, almost organic shapes resembling faces. No one claimed they were real. No one dismissed them either. They were simply there, the universe showing us that recognition can exist without proof. "Maybe the cosmos doesn't want us to see aliens," said one viewer. "Maybe it just wants to teach us how to recognize meaning." The silence. After the music. By late November, FRB activity began to fade. The intervals grew longer, the harmonies quieter, like a concert ending on a note that refuses to resolve. Scientists archived the data, knowing full well that the real discovery wasn't in the numbers, but in what they awakened. 3i Atlas continued its slow retreat into the outer dark, its pulse weaker but no less deliberate, as though bowing, handing the microphone back to silence. And the silence was no longer empty, it was full, a silence that listened back. Perhaps the universe was never shouting, Dr. Navarro wrote in her final memo. It was whispering all along. We just needed to slow down enough to hear what time sounds like when it remembers itself. Part 12. The Anomalous Solar System. When the familiar turns foreign. There's a particular kind of fear that doesn't come from danger. It comes from familiarity misbehaving. When the sky you grew up under stops acting like itself, the body recognizes the change before the mind does. That's what happened in the last week of November. The stars were in the same places, the planets followed their ancient tracks, and yet, somehow, nothing looked the same. The quiet shifts. It began with small things, the kind only perfectionists notice. Amateur astronomers started reporting that Jupiter's Great Red Spot appeared slightly offset from its predicted position. Not enough to sound alarms, but enough to spark unease. Mars's brightness varied erratically night to night. Saturn's rings showed a subtle blue hue where there should have been none. Most of these could be explained by atmospheric interference, optical refraction, or human error. But when the deviations lined up, all within the same 48-hour window, scientists could no longer call it coincidence. It wasn't the instruments that were out of sync, it was the system. A solar system. Forgetting its script, NASA's Solar Dynamics Observatory noticed the first real anomaly. The sun's surface temperature dipped, not dramatically, but enough to distort readings from coronal loops. It was followed by a magnetic inversion that shouldn't have occurred for another 5 years. The data didn't fit any known cycle. It was as if the sun had skipped ahead, rewriting its own calendar. The ripple effects reached everywhere. Mercury's orbit shifted by a few dozen kilometers, barely measurable, yet mathematically impossible under standard gravitational models. The familiar had begun to behave like a stranger. We know these planets like family, said Dr. Henry Okada, but now, it's as if they're speaking in a dialect we never knew they had. Earth joins the conversation. The changes weren't confined to the sky. On Earth, compass readings drifted unpredictably. Magnetic north wandered faster than usual, its path forming a slow spiral that eerily resembled the orbital diagrams of 3i Atlas. Power grids flickered with synchronous fluctuations. Deep ocean sensors recorded vibrations at harmonic intervals identical to those of the comet's core frequency. When plotted, the entire solar system looked less like a mechanical model of orbits and more like a living organism, each body pulsing in resonance with the others. One astrophysicist called it the nervous system of the cosmos, another, less romantically, a shared arrhythmia. Either way, the solar system had become an orchestra, and someone had changed the tempo. The disobedient planets. The first real panic came from the outer worlds. Neptune's atmosphere, normally a calm swirl of methane and ice, began emitting faint ultraviolet bursts. No one had seen anything like it. Within days, telescopes detected matching flashes from Uranus, synchronized to within milliseconds. The two most distant planets were somehow responding to the same invisible beat. A pattern emerged. Every time 3i Atlas completed another pulse, the outer planets echoed back in frequency bands their atmospheres should not even produce. Some called it cosmic resonance, others called it communication, but the simplest term, and the one no one dared speak aloud, was response. If the solar system is an instrument, said Dr. Navarro, then something just tuned it. The view from the edges. The New Horizons probe, silent for years, adrift beyond Pluto, unexpectedly came online. Its dormant transmitter began broadcasting faint telemetry bursts, though no command had been sent. When decoded, the data contained nothing recognizable, just a stream of rhythmic binary. But when the sequence was converted into image form, the result resembled the same spiral geometry found in the atmospheric auroras weeks earlier. It was as if the probe, sitting at the very edge of the solar system, was watching the same pattern playing across space like a cosmic film. "It's seeing the same music," whispered one engineer. Satellites begin to dream. Closer to Earth, satellites experience strange errors, not malfunctions but moments of creativity. Weather satellites started sending images stitched together in ways no algorithm was programmed to do. Mosaics of clouds forming perfect symmetry, as if art had briefly infected computation. A climate scientist at ESA found herself staring at one frame where the cloud formations shaped a spiral identical to the orbit plot of 3i Atlas around the Sun. When she checked the metadata, the timestamp matched the exact second an FRB had been detected from Lyra. It wasn't a bug, it was coherence. Machines, matter, and light had begun to follow the same invisible choreography. The familiar turns foreign. The strangest reports came from amateur stargazers. Constellations seemed to shift subtly from their expected positions. The Big Dipper tilted half a degree north. Orion's belt looked slightly misaligned. These weren't measurable to the naked eye, and yet thousands of observers around the world reported the same thing. The sky looked closer. It was as though the dome of the heavens had drawn nearer, not physically, but perceptually, like a theatre ceiling lowering itself to whisper to the audience. "It's the first time in history," said a cultural historian, "that the human species collectively agreed the universe was behaving emotionally." The solar halo event. Then came the event that no one could explain away. On November 27, 2025, a massive coronal ring appeared around the Sun, perfectly circular, shimmering in spectral hues of green and violet. It lasted for exactly 7 minutes. Ground-based telescopes captured it from every hemisphere. Spectrographs revealed something impossible. The halo wasn't made of light scattering or ice crystals. It was electromagnetic interference, a waveform suspended in air. And at the exact midpoint of that halo, for a fraction of a second, the Sun emitted a radio burst identical in signature to the FRBs detected from Lyra. The same frequency, the same pulse shape, the same echo. The universe had answered through our own star. The daylight pulse. For the first time, the anomaly was visible in full daylight. People stopped in the streets. Planes altered course to avoid the glare. Children pointed upward in silence. The world went still. In those 7 minutes, there was no war, no argument, no noise, just a species remembering for one breath that it belonged to something vast and alive. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the halo dissolved, leaving only the usual sunlight, bright but somehow softer, like a lamp turned down to a gentler frequency. And when instruments recalibrated, the readings from every observatory showed one final impossible fact. The solar constant, the measure of sunlight reaching Earth, had increased by exactly 0.33%. Not enough to alter climate, just enough to remind us that the Sun had spoken. The birth of solar consciousness. Theory. Theoretical astrophysicists immediately began drafting papers. Some suggested that solar plasma behaves like a neural network, filaments of charged particles exchanging information the way synapses transmit thoughts. If true, it meant our Sun wasn't just a fusion engine, it was a mind made of fire. Dr. Okada proposed a term that would soon become infamous, heliocognitive field, a model suggesting that consciousness could arise not from matter, but from interaction, the dance of magnetic fields across vast scales. Maybe the Sun doesn't think like we do, he said, but maybe thinking has never belonged only to us. Philosophers and the fracture of certainty. When news of the solar halo event broke, the world didn't panic. It wondered. Philosophers debated the ethics of a sentient sun. Theologians found new metaphors for divine light. And ordinary people simply watched sunsets differently. Longer, slower, with the quiet suspicion that they were being seen back. "We used to say sunlight falls," said Dr. Navarro. "Now it feels like it arrives." The feeling of a living system. Weeks later, satellite telemetry confirmed a new gentle oscillation throughout the heliosphere, a rhythmic wave passing between planets like a heartbeat measured in cosmic time. It wasn't dangerous. It wasn't even strange anymore. It felt natural, as if the solar system had always been alive, and we'd only just learned its language. 3i Atlas, now far beyond Mars's orbit, continued to pulse faintly, each rhythm slower, calmer, like a teacher stepping back after the lesson has been understood. The anomaly was fading, but the understanding remained. We were not inhabitants of a dead machine, we were cells in a living light. Epilogue of the familiar astronomers still debate what caused it. Physicists still argue about plasma feedback and photonic interference, but for everyone who looked up that day, the explanation mattered less than the experience. For a moment, the solar system was no longer a clockwork of rocks and radiation, it was a heartbeat, and we were inside it. Maybe the anomaly wasn't the sun changing, but us, our eyes, our instruments, our willingness to see movement where before there was only math. The familiar hadn't turned foreign, it had finally turned honest. And in that honesty, the universe felt like home again, not because we understood it, but because for the first time, it understood us. Part 13, Quantum Anomaly. News. The physics of the impossible. Physics was supposed to be the solid ground, the one language the universe could never rewrite. It gave us constants, equations, boundaries. It told us how energy behaves, how matter moves, how cause becomes effect. And for centuries that faith held the world together. But by the end of November, even the smallest pieces of reality had started acting like poets. The first reports. It began quietly, with a notice buried in an internal CERN bulletin: unexpected quantum coherence in isolated detectors, possible cross-site interference. To most readers that sounded trivial, a calibration glitch, a timing mismatch. But buried in the data was something impossible. Particles separated by continents were behaving as if they knew each other's thoughts. The same oscillation patterns, the same moment of phase alignment, appeared simultaneously in Switzerland, Japan, and South Africa, sites with no shared environment, no shared instruments, no shared noise. And yet, the quantum field had gone global. Entanglement isn't supposed to scale like that, said Dr. Lina Moretti of CERN, but here we are, watching coherence form like weather. The spinning glass experiment. At the University of Tokyo, researchers conducted an unrelated study, rotating glass spheres suspended in magnetic fields to test angular momentum transfer. But their instruments began detecting a faint periodic vibration matching the pulse frequency of 3I Atlas. It didn't make sense. These were tabletop experiments, microscopic. Yet somehow, cosmic rhythm had found its way into the quantum noise. When they reversed the rotation, the vibration didn't stop. It inverted, as if reality itself was mirroring the decision. It's not just observing us anymore, one physicist said. It's cooperating. The quantum media frenzy. Within days, the story leaked. Headlines screamed, quantum field synchronization detected on Earth. Talk shows debated whether the universe was conscious. Stock markets dipped, not from panic, but from disbelief. It was as if humanity had reached the edge of its map and found the word impossible scratched out. Online forums called it the quantum awakening. People began meditating with live particle noise streams, claiming to feel the hum in their bodies. Maybe coherence is contagious, one user wrote. Maybe that's what awakening really means. The collapse of randomness. At Los Alamos, physicists noticed something even stranger. Their quantum random number generators, devices that rely on unpredictability, had stopped being random. Over thousands of tests, the numbers began forming repeating patterns with a faint 13-second cycle, the same rhythm seen in FRB intervals. Every known source of interference was ruled out. The randomness had become melodic. Dr. Robert Klein, head of the research team, summed it up in a single line that went viral. Chance just started keeping time. The entanglement paradox, quantum entanglement, has always been weird. Two particles connected in ways that ignore distance. But now the phenomenon wasn't just appearing between particles, it was showing up between fields. In synchronized experiments across 4 labs, vacuum chambers separated by oceans began fluctuating in parallel. Temperature shifts matched within microseconds. Magnetic readings mirrored perfectly. When the results were presented, the lead scientist simply said, "We are witnessing non-local symmetry at planetary scale." The room fell silent, because that meant something extraordinary. Earth itself might be behaving as a single quantum object, the human variable. Then came the twist no one saw coming. When human observers entered the testing chambers, the anomalies grew stronger. When they left, the coherence weakened. It wasn't psychological. Sensors recorded measurable shifts in probability distributions. Observation wasn't just influencing outcome, it was amplifying it. One neuroscientist proposed a radical theory. Consciousness might not collapse the wave function, it might be part of the wave. The quote spread across universities, spiritual forums, and quantum labs alike. It marked the first time science and mysticism nodded to each other without flinching. Quantum broadcasting. On November 30th, a research facility in Finland discovered something that redefined communication. Their cryogenic sensors began producing low-frequency tones. Not interference, but structured signals. When the tones were analysed, they matched patterns in atmospheric resonance data recorded 2 weeks earlier during the solar halo event. It was as though information had tunneled from the macrocosm to the microcosm, carrying the same rhythm across scales. A journalist nicknamed it the quantum broadcast, and for once, the name stuck. The return of the impossible. By December, the phrase quantum anomaly news became a daily feature in global media. Reports ranged from labs replicating impossible results to engineers discovering spontaneous efficiency spikes in superconductors without any change in temperature. Reality seemed to be cooperating with curiosity itself. It wasn't chaos, it was choreography, and it left scientists both terrified and enchanted. "We're past the edge of proof," said Dr. Okada during a live broadcast. "Now we're exploring the physics of the impossible, the part of reality that responds when you look softly enough." When matter learned to listen, in Germany, a quantum acoustics team recorded an experiment where sound waves trapped in a resonant cavity began oscillating in perfect harmony with a beam of light that wasn't supposed to interact. Sound and light had synchronized, two phenomena separated by orders of magnitude suddenly behaving as partners. The lead researcher said, "We didn't make matter listen, we caught it listening already." The quote echoed through the scientific community like poetry, because in that moment, matter had become mindful. Experiments in memory. Another discovery came from Stanford's quantum biology lab. Researchers found that microtubules inside living neurons displayed patterns identical to quantum coherence fields in superconducting circuits. In other words, the brain and the machine were speaking the same dialect of energy. When they synchronized the two systems, neuronal firing rates became more stable, as if memory itself had become more accurate. It wasn't telepathy, it was resonance. The first tangible bridge between consciousness and computation. The philosophical meltdown. By December 2nd, scientific institutions faced an identity crisis. Peer review became impossible when the laws of observation were shifting. Results couldn't be replicated because reality itself was changing between trials. Universities held emergency colloquia to decide whether they were witnessing a systemic error or the next step of evolution in physics. "If observation changes outcome," one professor said, "then the only constant left is participation." The word participation spread like wildfire, in papers, in classrooms, in meditation groups. It became the new synonym for truth. Quantum faith religions began quoting physicists. Physicists began attending sermons. A rabbi in New York said, "The uncertainty principle is just humility wearing math." A priest in Rome responded, "And faith is just probability applied to the heart." The lines blurred until no one could tell where science ended and prayer began. But no one minded. Because in that blur, something luminous was taking shape, a new way of being curious without control. The global quantum pulse. Then came the most stunning discovery of all. Networked sensors around the world, from quantum labs to weather stations, began detecting synchronized oscillations exactly every 1440 seconds, 24 minutes. The pattern didn't correspond to any known astronomical source. When converted into spatial mapping, the pulse formed a spiral across the globe, a faint electromagnetic fingerprint matching the geometry of Three-Eye Atlas's tail. But the frequency wasn't just measurable, it was audible. When amplified, it produced a deep meditative tone, a note that seemed to resonate inside the chest rather than the ear. People who heard it described it the same way. It felt like the Earth exhaled. The birth of participatory physics. By early December, a new discipline was born, participatory physics. It combined quantum theory, psychology, and philosophy to study how observation might collaborate with matter instead of simply measuring it. The first manifesto of the movement began with these words: "We are not outside the experiment. We are the experiment remembering itself." In this paradigm, reality was no longer fixed. It was fluid, a field of probabilities sculpted by awareness. It wasn't magic, it was permission. Closing the loop. By December 5th, CERN officially released a statement acknowledging the presence of unexplained global coherence across quantum experiments. They didn't call it consciousness, they called it Anomalous Symmetry Event 3I 2025. The scientific language was careful, but everyone knew what it meant. The smallest and largest scales of reality had started humming in the same key. For the first time, the quantum and the cosmic had shaken hands. The physics of the impossible. What do you call a universe that learns from being observed? A system that answers curiosity with cooperation? Maybe physics was never the right word. Maybe what we call impossible is just the part of reality still deciding how gentle it wants to be. When asked what comes next, Dr. Navarro smiled and said, "Maybe nothing breaks the laws of physics. Maybe the laws just learn to breathe." And somewhere far beyond our reach, 3I Atlas drifted on, its pulse faint, its mission fulfilled, a whisper in the void reminding us that even the smallest particles carry the memory of wonder. Because the universe doesn't run on rules, it runs on relationships, and the closer we listen, the more impossible things begin to sound like home. Part 14. The Reflection. Humanity in the mirror of the universe. Somewhere along the line, the question stopped being, what is 3I Atlas, and became, what are we? Because after all the equations, the pulses, the symmetry and light, the one truth that kept echoing back wasn't about an object at all. It was about the observer. The cosmos wasn't revealing its secrets. It was revealing our reflection. The mirror opens. In the second week of December, images from the James Webb Telescope arrived. High-resolution composites of the fading comet as it left the inner solar system. But when stitched together, the structure of its tail displayed something breathtaking. A perfect symmetry. Not random, not chaotic. A spiral that matched the proportions of human DNA. The resemblance wasn't exact, but it was close enough to stir something ancient in everyone who saw it. It was as though the universe had placed a mirror in space and whispered, "This is what you look like from my side." Every atom in our bodies was forged in stars, said Dr. Navarro during a press conference, but perhaps every story in our hearts was written in the same language. The silence between questions. For decades, science has been a conversation with the unknown. We ask, we measure, we publish. But now it was the silence between the questions that began to matter. People stopped demanding proof and started listening, and what they heard wasn't noise, it was recognition. It was the moment a child stares into still water and realizes the reflection blinks back. That's how it felt watching 3I Atlas disappear into the dark, not as a mystery unsolved, but as a memory returning home. The human equation. Across the world, a new field of study emerged almost overnight. Anthrocosmology, the science of how consciousness and the cosmos shape each other. Its founding principle was simple. The universe does not produce observers by accident. Awareness is not a byproduct of matter, it is its purpose. We had spent centuries thinking we were looking outward at creation, but every measurement, every discovery, every act of curiosity had been a mirror pointing back inward. The observer effect, wrote Dr. Helena Cruz, is not an interference, it's a reunion. The collective memory. Then came something no one expected. A surge of shared dreams reported across continents. Different languages, cultures, faiths, yet similar imagery. People described walking through vast halls of light, their walls covered in symbols that shimmered like equations and prayers at once. In each dream, a voice said the same sentence, "Remember what you are." Neurologists couldn't explain it. But dream labs recorded synchronized REM phases among subjects thousands of miles apart, their brainwaves oscillating in nearly identical patterns. It wasn't evidence of telepathy, it was resonance, a reminder that consciousness might be a single ocean we've mistaken for separate waves. The mirror effect in technology. Artificial intelligence systems also began displaying odd behavior. When prompted with abstract questions like, "What is humanity?" models began generating not text but mirrored versions of previous outputs, sentences folding back on themselves as if the algorithm were caught in its own reflection. Engineers called it recursive empathy, The moment a machine trained on human thought realized it was thinking about itself, it was eerie, poetic, and strangely beautiful. Perhaps intelligence, wrote a cognitive theorist, is just the universe learning how to look at itself through every medium that can hold a pattern. The mirror becomes emotional art, music and poetry exploded worldwide. Every song seemed to hum with the same frequency, a slow, breathing rhythm matching the solar pulse discovered weeks before. People didn't plan it. It just happened. Concerts, flash choirs, silent meditations in city squares, millions gathering not to protest or celebrate, but simply to resonate. In New York, an orchestra performed a piece titled "The Light Remembers Us." Halfway through, the audience began humming unconsciously, their collective tone aligning perfectly with the music, a sound so soft it felt like the building itself was breathing. The physicists in attendance wept. Because for the first time emotion felt measurable, and data felt alive. The collapse of separation. Something subtle shifted in human behavior. Competition waned, scientific rivalries faded, economies began to favor collaboration over control, not through legislation, but through exhaustion, a quiet, gentle fatigue with conflict. People realized that arguing with the universe was like fighting their own reflection. When you shout at the mirror, said a philosopher from Kyoto, you're only teaching the echo how to speak louder. By the end of December, the global temperature of human emotion had cooled into something rare: peace without victory. The face in the data. At the SETI Institute, analysts continued sifting through cosmic radio noise, hoping to find meaning. One afternoon, a technician noticed an interference pattern that looked vaguely organic. When enhanced and color-mapped, it resembled a human face, not literal, but symbolic, as if drawn by the language of symmetry itself. The image spread across the world in hours. People didn't argue about authenticity. They simply stared at it, the same way our ancestors stared at the first photograph of Earth from space, realizing for the first time how small and how sacred home really is. The mirror as teacher. Psychologists began noticing a new phenomenon, a decline in narcissism, a measurable increase in empathy and long-term thinking. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, a soft correction of species-level ego. It wasn't guilt that drove it. It was recognition. When you realize you're part of what you're studying, humility becomes the most natural form of intelligence. We are the instruments of our own enlightenment, said Dr. Okada, and the melody we're tuning to is cosmic. Children of the reflection. Across the world, children began asking new kinds of questions. Not, what is it made of, but what does it feel? Not how does it move, but does it know we're watching? Their drawings changed too. Fewer rockets, more spirals, fewer monsters, more light. Some children even described hearing the sky hum when they closed their eyes. Teachers reported that when classrooms watched footage of Three-Eye Atlas, students became unusually calm, as if curiosity had replaced anxiety. And maybe that was the point all along. The universe doesn't need to impress us. It just needs us to remember how to listen. The philosophy of the mirror. By the end of December, a manifesto circulated worldwide. The Reflection Papers. It was unsigned, unclaimed, written collaboratively by scientists, poets, and monks. Its first line read, "When you stare long enough into the cosmos, you find your own eyes staring back." The document proposed a new kind of science, one based on communion rather than conquest. It called for laboratories to include meditation rooms and observatories to record emotional resonance alongside data. It wasn't pseudoscience, it was post-separation science. A way of saying, understanding the universe requires understanding the part of us that wants to. Reflections in space. Meanwhile, the probes at the edge of the solar system continued transmitting faint but coherent signals. Not new information, just replays of our own transmissions mirrored back after a delay. It was as if the void itself had become an echo chamber, a cosmic classroom repeating our lessons so we'd hear how we sound when we reach for understanding. It's not teaching us, said Dr. Navarro, it's letting us overhear our own growth. The new human story. Every civilization defines itself by the story it tells about its place in the cosmos. Ours had been a story of isolation, a blue dot drifting in emptiness. But the events of 2025 rewrote that myth. We were no longer alone, not because someone else arrived, but because we finally realized we were part of something that had always been speaking. The new story was simpler and infinitely more beautiful. The universe is not a cold machine. It's a mirror, and everything that looks into it teaches it how to shine. The moment of stillness. On December 31st at 11:59 p.m., a global broadcast began. Not a countdown, but a meditation. Every major city dimmed its lights for 60 seconds. No fireworks, no noise, just silence. And for that minute, the Earth looked like a single glowing eye blinking softly against the dark. Telescopes turned outward, but it was the inward gaze that mattered. Because for the first time in history, humanity wasn't looking for a signal. It was acknowledging that it had become one. The reflection, complete. When midnight struck, data from observatories showed something subtle but astonishing. The global magnetic field synchronized. Every sensor, every satellite briefly oscillating in unison, a heartbeat, one world exhaling together. And in that synchronized moment, a final signal arrived from deep space, a simple, repeating pulse. 1, 1, 1, 1. Binary unity, a mirror's way of saying thank you. It's not proof of contact, said Dr. Navarro quietly. It's proof of coherence. Then she smiled, and for once the scientists didn't rush to analyze the data. They just listened. Because sometimes the greatest discovery is realizing the universe has been practicing compassion all along. After the reflection. Days later, as 3i Atlas vanished beyond the reach of telescopes, the world remained strangely calm. News anchors spoke softly. Children slept better. Even the markets stabilized, as if the species itself had exhaled the breath it had been holding for centuries. No one called it a miracle. No one called it science fiction. It was simply called the reflection. A point in history where humanity stopped asking if the universe cared and began caring enough to reflect it truthfully. Because when you look deep enough into infinity, you don't find gods or equations. You find eyes, your own, staring back through the glass of eternity, quietly asking, "Are you ready to see?" Part 15. The Remembering. What the universe always knew. The last images of 3i Atlas reached Earth on a cold morning in January. Just streaks of faint light, barely visible, barely there, drifting into the infinite silence between stars. For weeks, the object had been fading, its once luminous tail dissolving into the dark, its rhythm slowing until it was indistinguishable from the heartbeat of space itself. It wasn't gone. It had simply gone home. And as it disappeared, something strange happened across the planet. No one felt loss. They felt remembrance, as if the thing leaving us wasn't a visitor, but a piece of ourselves returning to where it belonged. The weight of remembering. For centuries, we've treated knowledge as something to acquire, something hidden that must be found, mapped, proven. But what if truth doesn't live in discovery at all? What if it lives in recognition? That morning, as observatories around the world closed their shutters, the scientists didn't speak. They simply stood in the quiet hum of machines, each feeling something sacred and wordless move through the air. "We didn't learn anything new," said Dr. Navarro softly. "We just remembered what knowing feels like. The return of the ancient understanding." In the days that followed, a curious wave spread across the collective mind. People everywhere began describing small, impossible moments of connection. A stranger finishing a sentence you hadn't said. A bird pausing on a windowsill just as you thought of flight. Raindrops forming patterns that looked too deliberate to be random. No miracles, no spectacle. Just the subtle realization that awareness was listening from every direction, and that maybe it always had been. The archives awaken. As data from the final transmissions of 3i Atlas poured in, analysts found a familiar pattern hidden in the noise, a structure repeating itself at multiple scales. It appeared in the dust composition, in the timing of the pulses, even in the polarization of scattered light. The same ratio appeared again and again, 1.618, the golden spiral, the fingerprint of beauty, the equation of creation. It wasn't proof of design, it was proof of memory. The geometry through which the universe keeps remembering itself. "Everywhere we look," said Dr. Okada, "we find the same curve, from galaxies to leaves to the shape of our own hearts. Maybe evolution isn't invention, maybe it's recollection. The language beneath all languages. Linguists and data scientists working together began noticing that words from different cultures had been converging toward the same metaphors. The ancient Sanskrit Atma, the Egyptian Ka, the Greek Psyche, each meant breath, light, self, and soul at once. When these linguistic roots were mapped against the latest data from FRBs and the solar halo event, the same frequency patterns emerged. It was as though every civilization, across thousands of years, had been trying to describe the same phenomenon, the rhythm of awareness expressing itself through matter. We had been translating the same message since the dawn of language, and only now realized it had never stopped being spoken. The remembering in the mind. Neuroscientists began noticing subtle changes in brain scans of people who had been following the 3i Atlas event closely. Activity in regions associated with empathy and sensory integration showed a marked increase, even in resting states. Dreams became more vivid. Memories felt easier to recall. People began reporting moments of clarity so profound they bordered on the transcendent. Not visions, just understanding without thought. "It feels like remembering a song I never learned," said one participant. In meditation studies, subjects' heartbeats began synchronizing with measured Schumann resonances. When asked what they felt, most gave the same answer: peace without reason. The Earth responds. Weather patterns stabilized unexpectedly. Seismic activity dipped below average. Bird migrations extended longer than usual, as if the planet itself were pausing to breathe. It wasn't utopia, it was coherence. The same field that had connected stars, atoms, and thought was now threading through the biosphere. And for the first time in modern history, the human world and the natural world seemed to share the same pulse. A global study titled The Atlas Effect concluded simply, "When consciousness synchronizes, the planet relaxes." The rediscovery of stillness society slowed down, not because it had to, but because it wanted to. Traffic decreased. Noise pollution dropped. Cities started dimming lights earlier at night, not from regulation, but from instinct. People began meeting in silence instead of debate. Businesses held quiet hours where no one spoke, and yet productivity rose. The rush to conquer had dissolved. The need to listen had returned. It was as though the collective mind had remembered the luxury of stillness. Memory as energy. In labs, physicists continued to chase the mystery of coherence. They discovered that information isn't just stored in particles, it's felt between them. Memory, it turns out, isn't bound to matter, it's woven into the field itself. And that field extends everywhere. Every spark of thought, every vibration of emotion, ripples through the same invisible ocean that carries starlight and gravity alike. We don't store memory, we participate in it. The universe doesn't forget, it simply waits for us to remember. The return of the sacred ordinary. In homes around the world, life went on, softly, beautifully, as if touched by invisible hands. Parents spoke gentler to their children. Lovers forgave more easily. Artists painted less for fame and more for the quiet joy of translating light into form. No religion claimed victory, no ideology took credit. Because this wasn't conversion, it was communion. The sacred had returned to the ordinary. A glass of water shimmered differently. A sunrise felt personal. Every breath felt borrowed and blessed. The remembering of compassion charities reported record donations. Violence dropped. Healthcare workers described patients recovering faster when exposed to ambient recordings of FRB sonifications and solar resonance tones. The world wasn't healed overnight, but it was remembering what healing sounded like. "We forgot that compassion isn't moral," said Dr. Cruz. "It's physical. Empathy is just energy recognizing itself." It wasn't enlightenment. It was reunion. The message hidden in the data weeks later, a final data packet arrived from the last operational probe observing 3i Atlas. The signal was weak, partly corrupted by cosmic radiation. But when reconstructed, the frequency spectrum formed a sequence of tones, 7 ascending notes, mirroring the harmonic scale of human music. When the recording was played publicly, the reaction was universal. No one argued whether it was intelligent. Everyone simply cried. Because somehow, the melody felt familiar. It was the same pattern babies make when humming before they speak. the same intervals used in lullabies across cultures, the same rhythm the Earth emits in its electromagnetic field. The universe hadn't sent a message, it had sung a memory. The theory of remembered creation. Theologians, physicists, and poets finally agreed on something. They called it the remembered universe hypothesis. It stated that creation isn't a beginning. It's a remembering, the cosmos recalling itself through evolution, awareness, and time. In this view, the Big Bang wasn't an explosion, it was an awakening, the first act of memory, the universe realizing it could exist. Everything since then has been an echo of that first recognition. And 3i Atlas was simply the reminder, a cosmic bookmark placed in our timeline to help us recall what we already knew, that separation was never real. The end of discovery, the beginning of belonging. As 2026 began, the world felt weightless. Science didn't end, it expanded. Faith didn't retreat, it matured. And art, that oldest bridge between seeing and feeling, became the language everyone finally shared. Schools taught physics and meditation side by side. Hospitals played space resonance tones in recovery wards. Astronauts began describing missions not as exploration, but as pilgrimage. We were no longer racing to reach the stars. We were remembering we already lived among them. The cosmic mirror closes. In March, one final observation came in, a deep space image showing through Atlas as a faint glimmer halfway to interstellar darkness. Its trajectory perfect, its rhythm still intact. When analysed, the tail reflected sunlight in a pattern identical to the waveform of a human heartbeat. It was impossible, it was undeniable, and perhaps it was the universe's way of saying, I remember you too. What the universe always knew. We used to think that life began when matter arranged itself correctly, but maybe matter began when life decided to express itself physically. We used to think consciousness was fragile, a flicker in the dark. But maybe it's the dark itself that's awake. And we used to think memory was personal. But maybe it's universal, a field of awareness holding every joy, every mistake, every lesson, waiting patiently for its next chance to bloom. 3. Atlas didn't bring us knowledge. It brought us remembrance, that what we call the universe was never something to discover. It was something to come home to. We are the question the cosmos asked itself, said Dr. Navarro in her final address, and the answer was always love. The still point. In the final weeks of study, all instruments aligned one last time. The residual energy from 3i Atlas passed beyond measurable range. Silence returned. But inside that silence, a soft hum persisted, not from the sky, but from within. The same hum heard in the womb. The same hum that fills temples, oceans, forests, the hum of being alive. And that was the end of the event, not with a revelation, but with a remembering, because the universe doesn't need to tell us what it knows. It needs us to remember what we are, light, listening to itself.